Hey guys, welcome back. I wanted to run through my predictions for the upcoming states of Arizona, Florida, Illinois, and Ohio for the 2020 Democratic presidential primary. But before going through those predictions, I want to do an overall discussion on where we stand at this point in the process. And these prediction videos aren't quite as interesting the more we've moved our way through primary season, given the fact that in recent weeks, Joe Biden has staked his claim as the clear frontrunner. He's doing really well in the polls. And also, this is almost kind of a replay of what we had back in 2016, where you had the more centrist establishment type Democratic candidate in Hillary Clinton being challenged by the progressive, more so political outsider in Bernie Sanders. And now Joe Biden has kind of taken the mantle of Hillary Clinton this time around, where Bernie Sanders playing the role of himself. But if we just take a look this past week, it should have been an area where Bernie Sanders had a lot of success, given a lot of these states he did quite well in back in 2016 with this contrast between himself and Hillary Clinton, but not as much this time around. Specifically, states like Michigan and Missouri. Basically, in the Midwest they were around 50-50 between Clinton and Sanders. Sanders was able to eke out a win in Michigan, and Clinton was able to eke out a win in Missouri, but like I said, essentially around a 50-50 split between Sanders and Clinton. But this time around in 2020, Biden was able to pick up rather clear margins of victory in both of those Midwestern states. So not a great sign there from Bernie Sanders. Also, states like Idaho and Washington, they were caucuses back in 2016. Sanders ran away with those, winning by significant margins over Hillary Clinton. They switched to primaries in 2020, but still areas where you'd figure Bernie Sanders would be able to have success. Joe Biden was able to claim a competitive victory in Idaho, as well as a very competitive result there in Washington. So another poor sign for Bernie Sanders if he's going to have success going forward. Now, to take a look at where we stand with the pledged delegates, I don't have any problem with Bernie Sanders wanting to stay in this race as long as he wants to, but again, given the results of this past week, it's a tough hill for him to climb. It was already a tough hill after Super Tuesday, but it became even more difficult after this past week of the primaries. We can see Joe Biden at 890 pledged delegates, Bernie Sanders at 736. So in terms of the percentage of current pledged delegates that have been divvied up, Biden is at 50% and Sanders is at 41%. So you look at those numbers and you might think, well, this isn't too much of a hill for Bernie Sanders to overcome if he can start getting things going back in his direction. And I understand where you're coming from if you have that opinion. But again, with this past week in a number of these states where Bernie Sanders had a lot of success or was very competitive with Clinton back in 2016, he wasn't able to do that this time around against Joe Biden. So it's painting a picture that's becoming very difficult for Sanders to go on and have success going forward. Now, if the shoe was on the other foot and we had Joe Biden at 736 pledged delegates and Sanders at 890, I don't think we'd be hearing as many calls for Joe Biden to step out of the race. I feel like it would be more of a discussion that we should let the system and the process play itself out. We'll go to the convention. If nobody has the majority of pledged delegates, then we'll let the superdelegates decide at that point in time. I feel like, again, if the shoe was on the other foot and Bernie Sanders was leading with Joe Biden trailing, that would be a bit more of the discussion than what we're having at this point with Bernie Sanders trailing Joe Biden. It's a bit of a double standard. It is a bit hypocritical for individuals to change their opinion on whether a candidate should drop out or not based on if they support them. My own personal opinion on this is if Bernie Sanders doesn't have any success in these upcoming primaries that we have in Arizona, Florida, Illinois, as well as Ohio, then he should seriously consider dropping out of the race. And that's not just my opinion for Bernie Sanders. It would also be my opinion for Joe Biden if things were reversed and Bernie Sanders had the kind of lead that Joe Biden currently has. Because when poll after poll that we're seeing, Joe Biden is considerably ahead of Sanders. We're talking by convincing margins, both nationally as well as in these state-specific primary polls. And based on what we saw in the debate last night, not enough to change the current picture of this primary. It just is what it is. I'm not sure how much value there'll be going forward in having the rest of this competitive primary play itself out, especially with the current health concerns that we have in the United States. It's not necessarily a great idea to have people gathering at polling places and potentially spreading around a virus. But anyways, that's the discussion that I wanted to do about the race as a whole. Now getting into Arizona, Florida, Illinois, as well as Ohio. So starting off here with Arizona, there's a Hispanic contingent here clearly in the state of Arizona. That should be a bit of a net positive for Bernie Sanders. But on the flip side, you have a lot of retirees, a lot of older voters. That should be a strong net positive for Joe Biden. This has been a positive for Joe Biden throughout this process. So I think the older voters are going to push Joe Biden into a victory here out in the state of Arizona, with Bernie Sanders getting second place. Now, Another thing here with the health crisis that we have going on in the United States, it's going to dissuade potentially some of these older voters from coming out and participating in the democratic process, which is a disappointment. I don't think Bernie Sanders would want to have more electoral success because old people decided that they didn't want to show up and vote. But that is something to keep in mind, where maybe it's a little bit more competitive if you have a lower turnout among those older voters, because there is a stark generational contrast between Biden and Sanders, where Sanders absolutely cleaning up the vote under the age of 45, where Biden is cleaning up over the age of 45. And that's just how this primary has been playing itself out. Now, Florida, one of those southeastern states, Bernie Sanders has been getting absolutely crushed in the southeastern states thus far. South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi. Bernie Sanders did really poorly against Hillary Clinton in Florida back in 2016, and I expect potentially an even more significant victory for Joe Biden this time around in comparison to what Hillary Clinton was able to have in the state back in 2016. And then Illinois, so this is a Midwestern state, and we can kind of compare it to the results that we had in Michigan as well as Missouri last week. Illinois is right smack dab between those two states, and it was also essentially around a 50-50 split between Clinton and Sanders, just like Missouri and Michigan were. But since Joe Biden picked up rather convincing victories in both Missouri and Michigan this time around, you would figure that Biden would be able to carry that over into the state of Illinois. Also, Biden likely to do really well with that African-American voting contingent in and around the Chicago area, the population center of the state, and also just the ties that Joe Biden has to Barack Obama. Obama, of course, was the former senator of the state of Illinois. So then moving over to the state of Ohio, and this was actually an area where Clinton was able to have a little bit more of a margin of victory over Bernie Sanders than what we typically saw throughout the rest of the Midwest. I think a big reason for this is the fact that we had a competitive Republican primary back in 2016, and a lot of independent voters opted to vote on the Republican side as opposed to the Democratic side, and that was more than likely a net negative for Bernie Sanders, who typically does really well among those independent voters. But even with that being the case, if I feel like Joe Biden is going to go on and carry a state like Illinois, I would also feel like he's going to be carrying a state like Ohio, and probably by something in the way of a decent margin. But even though the polls at this point in time are really positive for Joe Biden in these four states, as well as just the national overall picture and where this race stands between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders would indicate that he's likely to go on and win these four primaries and by decent margins, the wrench that's thrown into this whole thing is the health crisis that we have going on. Older voters might be less likely to go out and participate. I don't think that's necessarily a great way to go on and be competitive in these primaries by hoping a voting bloc doesn't show up, but it is the situation that we find ourselves in. We'll see what happens on election day tomorrow. And of course, I'll be recapping exactly what happened in these areas. If Bernie Sanders isn't competitive or having anything in the way of success, I wouldn't be totally shocked if at some point in the near future he decided to step down, but we'll see how the rest of this process plays itself out. So I appreciate you guys stopping by. Consider subscribing to the YouTube channel, and I'll see you back here for future videos.